We discuss what Palpatine was thinking as he was yoked down a shaft on today's Star Wars video. Hey guys, this is EckhartsLadder. Hello and welcome to another Star Wars video. So by this point, both Star Wars canon and Legends have done their somehow Palpatine has returned thing. Of course, in Star Wars canon, Palpatine's a little bit slow to the draw. It's about 30 years after the Battle of Endor by the time he returns and with the Sith Eternal tries to make another claim to the galaxy. However, in Star Wars Legends, Palpatine waits less than a decade, returning to helm the Dark Empire in 9 to 10 ABY. Before being defeated again, as was the case in Star Wars canon. Although Palpatine is a really important part of both canon and Legends, we don't actually get a lot from the character's perspective. Palpatine is almost uniformly just a force for pure evil. He's nearly always an antagonist, so with a few exceptions, including one of my favorite Star Wars books of all time, Plagueis, we don't get a lot from Palpatine's perspective. When it comes to what Palpatine was thinking upon being thrown down the reactor shaft in Star Wars canon, we don't know a whole lot. There's a brief excerpt from the Rise of Skywalker novelization where Rey actually sees, at least somewhat, from her grandfather's eyes. In that moment just after being thrown, and he felt a betrayal sharp as stinging, a figure high above, black-clad and helmeted and shrinking fast. His very own apprentice had turned against him, the way he himself had turned against Plagueis, whose secret to immortality he had stolen. After that, through the dark side of the Force, Palpatine basically whisked himself away to the Citadel on Exegol within the already dying clone body. Then after that, of course, it's basically just Palpatine trying to return to power. I've got to say, before reading the novelization, I thought there was an interesting angle that they could take with the whole Rey Palpatine thing. I didn't like the idea overall, but I think it would have been interesting at least if Palpatine had realized that there's something to the bond between family, the bond between father and son, or grandfather and daughter. And I thought they could have written some interesting backstory for that, partially being the reason why Palpatine is now reaching out to Rey, or at least why he had a son in the first place. But of course, that's not the way they went. It ended up being that Palpatine's son was a failed clone. But anyway, let's not dwell on that fact. I assume we'll get more eventually about Palpatine's return and his early days with the Sith Eternal, but I'd like now to turn to Star Wars Legends, which I think handles things a little bit better, at least to an extent. So in Legends, Palpatine returns in the Dark Empire comics. Dark Empire 1, I would say, is actually legitimately pretty good, and they get worse after that point. They kill Palpatine first of all on his eclipse, then he returns in another clone body, and that gets to be a bit much, but I think that Legends handles his return better than canon. However, just like in canon, Dark Empire doesn't give us a whole lot about what Palpatine's thinking, his motivations. He's treated solely as an antagonist. Thankfully, the Dark Empire source book actually came along and not only united a lot of early bits of Star Wars lore at that point, including the Thrawn trilogy, which was released at the same time, but also adds some really interesting details about the Empire's state after Endor, Palpatine's return, and more. So both Legends and canon have this idea that if the Empire wasn't able to protect its Emperor, or if Palpatine wasn't to lead the Empire, then nobody would. In canon, this resulted in the Contingency and Operation Cinder, whereas in Legends, the Empire just fell apart because Palpatine designed it to be that way. There were no immediate successors. The Empire was set up so without a central leader, bits would start fighting against each other, and eventually, all those who would attempt to gain illegitimate power would face off against others within the Empire and would hopefully be destroyed. So it's not surprising that one of Palpatine's first thoughts upon being destroyed was anger. Here's a quote from the Dark Empire source book. To a degree unseen since the days of Zim the Despot, Palpatine had created a state that simply couldn't function without him. It was no accident that the Empire was collapsing around his grave. No one could doubt his fondest wish had been that, if he should fall, then the universe would burn on his funeral pyre. Palpatine's journey back to life was also very difficult in Legends. He spent some time basically moving through nothingness until he was able to possess one of his servants, then later one of his many clone bodies on the Imperial Fortress world of Biss. Palpatine, however, took some some time to recover and retain his full strength, not 30 years while in a decrepit body like in canon. But after dying, Palpatine spent a lot of time observing the rest of the galaxy, watching his formerly loyal Imperial subjects, and getting increasingly disappointed and angry as instead of worshipping Palpatine even in death, they attempted to gain power for themselves. An example of this was Grand Admiral Thrawn. Palpatine was extremely disappointed that Thrawn tried to model a new empire with him as the head instead of remaining ever loyal. It's very likely that had Thrawn not been killed during his campaign, that Palpatine would have killed him himself. We actually get some details though about Palpatine's spirit journey in the Dark Empire sourcebook as well, particularly the fact that it was more difficult than he expected, and I quote, "His death he had planned for, just as he had planned for every other contingency. Still, this last time had been quite different from all the others. Previously, the clones had only been meters away, and the passing voluntarily in the comfort of his chambers. Nothing like the time of betrayal by his dark servant. This time was so abrupt and unexpected, so unpleasant that it felt as if perhaps a part of his being had been left in the space over Endor." I will note, by the way, that parts of that are not really canon. For example, the Dark Empire sourcebook and the Dark Empire comics make the suggestion that Palpatine has died and returned to life before, but that's something that's never been picked up in other media and has been outright contradicted by members of the Lucasfilm story group. Unlike with Thrawn, Palpatine was not disappointed in Vader. His betrayal was something that had long been expected. Palpatine realized that Luke Skywalker that is, and the bond between father and son was a potential weak spot for Vader, so he was not surprised when the betrayal eventually came, although he wasn't quite prepared for it to come in that exact manner, which is why it took him so long to return to his body. But yeah, that's all I've got to talk about for today's topic. I think it's pretty interesting insight into Palpatine. I will talk for just a minute about Plagueis because I do think that book is definitely worth reading. You can also listen to it on Audible at audibletrial.com/EckhartsLadder, or just get it from your library or whatever else. But in Plagueis, we actually get some internal monologue of Palpatine. We learn about his progression to the point of basically the night where he assassinates Plagueis and becomes Chancellor. And it's really interesting to see not only his internal monologue, but also how he's described and portrayed by Plagueis. He's a black hole of the Force, a force of nature for the dark side. But I also thought it was pretty interesting to see that Palpatine did have a little shred of humanity before undergoing his Sith training. There were maybe a couple of people that he wouldn't go out on a limb for, but he didn't actively dislike or want to kill. But that might have also just been a ruse that he was playing for Plagueis. Again, read the book yourself. I can't recommend it enough. If you're interested in the other topics that I covered in this video, you can check out the Dark Empire sourcebook, which is easily available online, and the Rise of Skywalker novelization, also on Audible. Till next time though, guys, have a good one, be safe, and may the Force be with you.